key is to making sure that you define what failing greatly looks like. So it's not running with scissors, right?
Yeah.
But rather it's really defining that there is a pathway to set yourself up for success. And sometimes the universe collides against you, the competition does something, there's a fly in the ointment. But if you understand it, to your point, then you do take on that mindset of, I didn't fail, I'm one step closer to an amazing unlock of success.
I'm very excited today to be here with Tariq Hassan. And I'm so excited because, as many of you know, he's someone who just has an incredible reputation within our industry for innovation, creativity, and kindness. Three things I'm passionate about. But I mean, two-time CMO, McDonald's, Petco. I mean, you can't get much better than that. Senior marketing positions at Bank of America, HP, but what's more, someone who has actually done both client and agency, leadership at Omnicom, leadership at FCB, and my favorite of all, started at my own alma mater, Leo Burnett. But again, thrilled to have you here, and thank you for taking the time today.
It's great to see you, my friend, and thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to catch up.
So I was thinking today, we had lunch right before the holiday, and we had a fantastic conversation about celebrating failure. And I just think about like today's environment with the amount of uncertainty, with the amount of pressure, and just honestly, I think like fear and like fear gripping people and fear of failure. I'd love to pick that up. And I mean, you had talked a lot about work you had done with McDonald's in terms of celebrating failure. And maybe just to start, we could lead into that.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think if you actually go back to You're My Roots, right, in the agency world and the role of creativity, I think we grew up in some ways, probably sometimes more productive than others, with almost a universal acceptance of you don't actually get to amazing creativity and great concept and great ideas if fear is dominating the room. So I think part of it comes from our roots of, completely unabashed craziness and fearlessness to get to great creativity. That probably stems a little bit of why when I moved over into the corporate world, trying to figure out what the unlock was and what the potential barrier could be to great creativity. And so in many ways, the observation around the fear of failure came out of trying to understand how to unlock amazing creative genius inside of organizations. But if I'm honest, in most situations, those things are really linked also to your own personal development, right? And so for me, as you and I discussed, a lot of this harkens back to my own development as a dyslexic, right? And I grew up in the era where we didn't really talk about it. We didn't really understand what it looked like. And we didn't really understand how to resolve a lot of those things and create coping mechanisms for people. And so you hid that away. And that actually became, in many ways, I think a little bit initially early in my life and frankly into my career, a barrier of my own fear that impacted my concern of failure, right? I think as I gained confidence in my career and I started to understand both how I work and how I think and unraveled my own relationship with dyslexia, I actually started to understand that that was actually a superpower as opposed to something I should be afraid of. It allowed me to look, as most dyslexics do, at things in a very different way. And that look around the corner difference, rather than being something that I hindered, which I did for a long time in my career, until I found a comfort for myself, and frankly, until I found great leaders around me to help unlock that. I think it actually started with myself and trying to understand, like, where does my own source of that fear of failure come from? And when you overcome it, boy, the amazing things it unlocks. And so translating that into the corporate world was more out of circumstance of requirement. And in both my last two senior roles, at Petco, where we're in a significant turnaround situation, and McDonald's, where we needed to really reignite the brand, we had to get that failure out of the room. And yet I had organizations that at moments had outright paralysis of fear of failure that got in their way. And so the question became one of, how do you unlock that?
Yeah. So there's so much in there that I want to unpack.
Yeah.
And I mean, just talking about creativity for one, but I think we'll come back to that. I wanted to start with how, in your own process, in your own experience, how did you overcome that as a leader? And obviously been very successful, but what was that? Was it a moment of transition? Was it an evolution? Was it mentorship? What was the unlock?
I think is a lot of cases, having great people around you that provide a pathway for learning for yourself, but then how do you translate that as a leader was significant. So I certainly had a number of mentors in my career that helped me unlock that. I think on the agency side, I was fortunate enough to work with some amazing clients that function that way. Gatorade was a pivotal brand for me to work on because the ethos of the brand, the scale of the brand by all rights should have never been the dominant player in the category that it was when you consider the major competitors were Coke and Pepsi. But the way that brand functioned was like an athlete. And my own athletic background, I think, came to life in terms of how I started to understand how to build brands and build ideas. Um, in that it's we used to talk about it's not the size of the dog, it's the size of the fight in the dog, right? And I think a lot of that woke up in myself. And I think that holds true of organizations. And I think we make the mistake sometimes of thinking that big organizations, big successful organizations like McDonald's, that's just not present. But the reality is, as leaders, when we see the potential in a brand and we see the potential in our own teams, and we can't figure out what exactly is unlocking them, I started to see a significant consistency around, frankly, around ensuring that there was enough psychological safety in the environment to allow teams to take that step into the bastion of the unknown, so to speak,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
right? To really to dramatize it, but to not only take that, but be excited about it, right? As opposed to apprehensive about it. And what I discovered was easily said, but not necessarily easily actioned. And so when I first joined McDonald's, I remember feeling that and talking to my leadership team, and we talked about a history that didn't even exist in the culture anymore, about concern of like if you failed, you went away. And so that's a really tough environment to ask people to get up and really exercise the most outer boundaries of their imagination to bring amazing creativity to it. So we had to figure out how we were going to remove that from the culture, which is where we came up the reference you were making. We decided we would celebrate it instead of walking away from it. And that meant also clarifying that there is really great ways to fail, right? There are amazing failures. And we defined a way we talked about them, right? That you laid out the objective clearly, that you brought a collaborative team together to work against it. You laid out the benchmarks for what success would look like, your KPIs for success. You checked in along the way, right? No surprises, helping people understand the trajectory of what you were trying to achieve. And more importantly, when it did fail, that you looked at the byproduct and the exhaust from that experience to see if there was a byproduct that could drive you either into a trajectory of success or learn for the next one, right? And startups are brilliant at this. I had to
Yeah.
basically teach my folks that our notion of failure is a startup's notion of pivot, which is a requirement if you're going to continue to grow and be successful. And so it's how do you reshape the language, and then how do you create that psychological safety around it?
And how did you do that? I mean, one of the things I think it's interesting, like I love the idea of like Einstein, is it's not 10,000 failures, it's
Yeah.
10,000 lessons. Many of us have worked in big organizations. How did you affect that culture where people actually trusted that that was the truth? Because I feel like so much of it is, and it's probably learned in school, right? How do you go about changing a culture as big as McDonald's?
Yeah, you're right though. It's embedded in us, right? To not do those things, but we also don't spend enough time understanding them and exploring them. I'll go back to the dyslexic thing, an early example to your point about learned behavior. I remember vividly high school physics exam where I had literally written these formulas across the entire exam where I had reversed part of the formula, but consistently reversed it through the entire thing. And the teacher called me up and said, like, I don't even know what to do with your final. You clearly knew what you were doing, but you couldn't be more wrong in how you did it, right? But I see the pattern, which meant you understood the information, right? So that was a minor sort of opportunity where it could have just been a typical failure. And instead, it was a reinforcement of, hey, let's understand why you made the mistake. Let's celebrate that you clearly understood some of those things, right? And so I've held that for a long time. And it sounds like a really simple,
It's
silly
a great
example,
story. Yeah, it's a
but
great
it's
story.
held, and you don't often recognize those things hold until you're actually doing them again. So from a culture perspective, and I remember the first time I went to my leadership team and I said, guys, you know what, we've now said this a couple times and people nod their heads in town halls, and then they go back to their daily work and they don't really change the behavior. And I actually had a Leo Burnett boss who used to say two things. One, say it twice, and if nothing changes, you have to put an action behind it, right? It goes back to that, don't say it, do it. And she also taught me, this is Nancy Lynn Davis, I don't know if you remember her, said,
Yes,
if you name
yes.
it, therefore it is, was one of the other great things she taught me. And so that is where the notion of the amazing almost came up, where I said to my leadership team, we're going to quarterly sit down and we're going to look at the absolute greatest failures of the quarter. I want your nominations, and then we're going to reward them as the amazing almost awards. And I remember my leaders initially cocked their heads sideways and, this is insane. You're going to call out people in front of the entire team for failing. And I said, we are. And we did it the first time, and they came back and said, we can't do this again. That was horrific. And I said, of course it was, because it's insanely uncomfortable. And we're going to keep doing it until that discomfort becomes an unlock to innovation and unlock to aspiration and unlock to inspiration to new ideas, until it becomes a comfortable muscle, an expected one. The key is to making sure that you define what failing greatly looks like. So it's not running with scissors, right?
Yeah,
But rather it's really defining that there is a pathway to set yourself up for success. And sometimes the universe collides against you, the competition does something, there's a fly in the ointment. But if you understand it, to your point, then you do take on that mindset of, I didn't fail, I'm one step closer to an amazing unlock of success. And that it
yeah,
just took repetition.
yeah. I love the idea of defining the path. It reminds me of another Leo Burnett quote, but just, most important trait for advertising is curiosity. Um, Actually taking the time to not say, okay, this is bad, but what did I learn? And therefore, what can we do better? Defining the path forward of the amazing almost. You then bracket your way to the success. The thing I think is interesting too is to your reference on agency experience. I would love if you could talk a little bit about, like, why is the agency so much different than client? What is that DNA, and what is it that you successfully brought forward or translated?
Look, I think it goes back to a bit of that psychological safety space, right? Think about all the things the clients don't see on the way to the great things that we would actually finally deliver to them. There was never a concern, unless at the end of one of those, creative explorations, you still didn't have the idea. That might be a little challenging, but there was
Yeah,
never a concern about, absolutely covering a wall with amazing, brilliant ideas, of which some were more brilliant than others and some probably shouldn't have been brought in the room. But there was never a danger in bringing them into the room. It was considered part of the organic process to get to that brilliance. And if every strategy or every creative idea hesitated on the fear of bringing it into the room would have been empty. And so that was our product, right? And
yeah,
so I think there's something just inherently in, like, this is our currency. And so you gotta make a mess to get there. And I think there's a comfort within that mess. And I think you and I grew up in a world, particularly when we were there with Burnett, where a lot of those quotes from Leo were still down the hallways and had people thinking differently about it. The reason you and I ended up in this conversation is where I get concerned, and the reason I'm continuing to focus in on this space is, it's not just the social environment around us, which causes enough anxiety and fear and challenges for people. But ironically, as we move to this next dimension of an AI driven innovative world, which has brilliance and is going to unlock additional creativity, I do have concern that the replacement to that fear of failure will be one of, the data made me do it. And we'll have
yeah,
leaders who simply focus on the data and don't take the chances. I happen to believe the data should be the thing that gives you the next best question. Not to suggest it doesn't provide confirmation. Sure, it does.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
it
yeah.
but in many situations, we should be using that data to create the next question and challenge it. And you think about even the way you use AI today, and you do your own. It's prompt on prompt on prompt, right? It's question on question on query on query. So if you start to remove, oh, I no longer have to be afraid because the data will just tell me, you might get really good work. I'm just not convinced you'll always get great work.
Yeah. You know what's interesting to me in that whole sequence? You talked about defining the path, and then you talk about AI as an input. For me, it's almost like the AI can provide guardrails and roadmaps, but again, like it's still that leap that needs to take place where you actually jump the chasm with something new and different, which you'll never get from AI. You know, the other thing I thought was really interesting about it too was you talked about a lot about safety. Um, I know, another big conversation we had just about the idea of creativity and kindness and the need for a kind, empathetic culture to create the safety to take
Yeah.
leaps. And again, it's interesting when you talk about the amazing almost. It's almost creating a culture of safety and formalizing it. But I would wonder, just in your own path again, like what as leaders can we do to enable or create safe environments? What as leaders can we do to allow people, amazing, almost great example, but to give people the confidence that great leaps are encouraged.
Yeah, look, I think part of what I've outlined is the what, but if that what wasn't delivered in the kind of empathetic how way that you're describing, then there's a dissonance, right? So I can't say we're going to allow that space, but the how I deliver it is unauthentic, or the implications of the failure are then retributive, right? You can't have that logical dissonance. And so what we realized very quickly was that what we were doing was actually a reflection of the narrative of the leadership itself and how we showed up, how we worked with one another, how we accepted those same failures as a leadership and allow that to be able to cascade down. And when I left the organization, um, which was an unbelievably proud and emotional moment with my team, as we sort of celebrated the end of the year, probably my proudest element was the notion of people talking about how we had brought a very different form of authentic leadership to the organization. And right. And that's just code language for that psychological safety. Now, here's the cool thing about it. That psychological safety we're talking about, that's not just a feel good management thing. There is actually tremendous amount of data. Google did a massive study in this space to look at what were the factors that drive the most high performing teams. And the single most significant factor in high performing team success wasn't resources, it wasn't time, it wasn't the talent of the team, it was psychological safety.
Wow. I had
So
not
there's
heard that.
data behind
That
this
is
as
cool.
well,
That is cool.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. It makes a ton of sense though. I mean, who's going to raise their hand and say, what if we did something wildly different? If you think you're going to get slapped in the process, it's interesting. And you know this as well, but you talk about these creative, putting everything up on the wall. It's that random one-off idea in the bottom left corner that, there's something interesting here.
Well, and that's what I mean. That took me down a rabbit hole, frankly, as I left and I really started to dig into this space, because it was a feature that I had done in my last two roles that I really started to see resonate. And as I started to talk to other leaders out in the marketplace, it was resonating with them. And another great mind and mentor of both of ours, it was Rashad Tabakawala who said to me, look, you need to keep pursuing this area. We need to talk about this. And he's been encouraging me to both do interviews and even consider, writing in this space as I've started to really dig into it. And so I started to look at the science behind it. And so the Google example is one example of the data that's out there. But here's the other elements of data that are fascinating around it. The inverse, organizations where the elements of fear run across the organization. And I want to be clear, this is not just, extreme dictatorial, threatening environments. It's not all on the edges. If you actually look at the data today, more than 80% of employees are fearful of having a conversation with HR. More than
Wow.
80% of employees are nervous that they aren't viewed as contributing enough to the organization, right? So there's elements of it that already exist inside the ethos. The flip side is for those leaders who function with the club, right? The rod and fear base,
Yeah.
they're actually roughly 28% less efficient and effective than their counterparts. They lose that much time in their week because it's energy taking to maintain that sort of, fear of threat or fear of, reprehension for people to be able to get things done. So even the model itself doesn't actually work for the business. So even when you remove the human impact, the business impact demonstrates it doesn't help and it doesn't work.
28%. So I'm going to play devil's advocate. So, celebrating failure, all that's well and good. And, Google is Google, but I have objectives, I have goals, that's all. How do I basically keep people accountable? If we're all talking about celebrating failure and safety.
All of us have to meet our goals and objectives, right? And the pursuit of those, you set up a strategic process and you set up a pathway for what success looks like. My point is that pathway looks exactly the same. Just sometimes when the outcome didn't achieve what it needed to, if you pursued the same great process that leads you to success, you actually did the right things to create a great failure.
Yeah.
Because we all say, well, there's no bad ideas. Yes, there are. A bad idea is both about how you approach it, its inability to be substantiated, and oh, by the way, like randomly going off and doing things that aren't in line with the objectives you're trying to achieve, the goals of the company, the outcome for the enterprise. But just because they're interesting, if they don't have an outcome that they achieve where we're trying to get to, it doesn't even matter if those are actually failures, right? And so part of it is just being really clear around the construct of what success looks like.
Yes. Yes. And how do you learn from it? How do you pivot? How do you move forward? And how do you keep moving forward? I love that. So I'm a young leader. I've totally bought into this. What advice would you have, tangible things you could do to create that safe environment? Within that team?
Yeah, I mean, one of the critical elements of that framework for failing greatly was, not going alone. And so as a young leader, the other thing times we can make mistakes is we have the spark of an amazing idea. Don't make that your hero moment.
Yeah.
Make it a collective hero moment, right? That's the critical element, right? There's the old African saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go farther, go together, right?
Yeah.
That's the cultural change you have to actually help your organization with, which is making sure, and that's why as we evaluated this wasn't about, sole, look what I did at moments. That process meant being cross-functional, being collaborative. Didn't mean slowing down. It just meant you brought people with you. And the reason is, just like success, failure is easy to explain if you've had people along the way on the journey with you.
Yeah.
They're both difficult to prove. Success and failure are hard to prove when no one else has been in the room witnessing them with you.
Yeah. That's really, really strong.
We as leaders, we set people up to, in some ways, we create this environment where we send people off to come back with a look what I did. Part of the cultural shift has got to be look what we did. Right? The similarities between success and failure are far greater than they are difference.
Say more. I love this.
Look, I think the outcome is ultimately what makes them define differently.
Yeah.
But my point is, if you look at the pathways to what's driven you to be successful, if you follow those same pathways and the outcome doesn't achieve it, 80% of what you did look the same as those that led to a successful outcome. It's the 20% that you need to then understand why you didn't achieve the success. But the reality is the road to get there looks quite often the same, unless we've had those moments where we've gone completely, like I said, where we run with scissors, and then you'll
Yeah.
again, I want to be clear. There's always going to be, those things on the fringes, right? There's all perfect, the perfect example we always talked about. I'll date ourselves, and I'll group you in that with me. But like the Post-it note's a perfect example, right? That was a 3M
Yeah.
failure. It was a product failure, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I also think too, the other thing I'd be interested is just also the role of luck. Um, Best idea, wrong time, best idea, wrong circumstance. Um, the role of luck and timing is just so intertwined too. And I think too, consistent with your point, the process is very similar. It's right application, right idea, right time, or even right product. It's funny, Leo Burnett, very close friends with Britt Nolan, but he talks about mayhem at Allstate. Basically said it was an idea that got killed multiple times. Um, it wasn't until cut rate insurance was basically framing up that you didn't need the protection, where they actually embraced the idea that like bad happens and mayhem exists. And all of a sudden it was an idea who found his time. So
I think that goes back to your question about where do we get that from in the agency, right? We grew up in a culture where many things, Phoenix rose from the fire on a lot of ideas that, had died. Many a creative
yeah,
had pulled things out of their files that died 2 generations ago and found light of day in a different context. I think that creates a bit of a cultural context for how the mind thinks who've come out of those creative spaces. The challenge becomes as you move into the corporate world, the ability to translate that in a way that fits into the corporate culture, that fits into the, make sure it links to that enterprise goal of what you're, strategy of what you're trying to achieve. Because you also get dissonance if you try to just apply the pure agency creative model to the corporate
yeah,
development model, right?
yeah.
And I've had those
I
moments.
also
I've made
found,
those mistakes.
yeah, I also found too, though, like my other experience having done Proctor and agency, it's actually allowing space too. Like one of the
Yeah.
things I always found at the agency is it's allowing the space and the time for people to vent good or bad ideas. And it's the yes and as opposed to starting with no. But it's interesting. I think for many clients, you're so sprinting to get to the finish line. You don't take the time to collect all the things you need along the way, which are actually going to lead to a better outcome. So
You just said something that my creative leader at McDonald's, she used to say constantly, right? She'd remind people to start of the meeting, are you coming in the room with the mindset to say yes? And it
yeah,
sounds like such a semantic thing, but it's really, really not, right? If you come in with the posture looking for a way to say yes to things, you will explore them in a very different way than being on that fearful side of, oh my gosh, I need to be cautious to make sure this is perfect, therefore say no, right? It's
yeah,
a, it's a
yeah.
really, really minor thing, but it's so important.
It's huge. I walked away with so much. I mean, amazing almost. And defining the path, creating the curiosity, proven statistics and value of safety versus a 28% decrease in productivity in a culture of failure. Stronger together. The idea of winning as one, and just lastly, I love the idea of a mindset of yes. Like any just closing thoughts before we wrap?
I mean, I think my closing thought ties to the center point that I know is your mission, which all of those things you just talked about inherently are powerful, but they only work in the context of the leadership culture you create, which is the only place this works is when it's based in authenticity, when it's based in kindness, when it's based in empathy, when it's based in that permissioning mindset, right? If you don't show up as leaders around it, and if your people don't feel it when you're not in the room that they still can, then all of this is just theory and interesting models and a possible way of doing things. But none of it works unless the cultural adaptation lines up to with those core pillars you talked about, which are about that authenticity, that kindness, that permission, empathy, forgiveness, right? Those things aren't present. This is just an interesting conversation.
I could not pick a better way to end. Thank you, Tariq. This has been really a lot of fun for me. Excited to share this with others, and I know that your inspiration and is going to continue, and hopefully, great creative ideas are going to be born out of this. So, thank you.
It's my pleasure, and it would only be fitting to say it's not my inspiration. It's the collection of, and I think this is where you and I come from culturally. Our inspiration is a collection of all those experiences of the people we've worked with, the brands we've worked with, the great things we've developed, and the dogs that we've developed, right? So I think that's what those things form. And I think the difference is you just get to a place in your career where you can turn down the me voice and turn up the we voice. And that actually becomes much more celebratory, is to watch the win happen with other folks on your team, right? And I think that's a lesson. It certainly took me longer in my career. I wish I'd had a mentor that sort of gave me a quick swat and told me, like, that scorecard is a lot more enjoyable when you're not on it.
Yeah.
It's a much more enjoyable part of my career now to be focused on watching the wins of others and knowing that you played a role in helping enable, coach, and mentor them to get there. And I think that's the point you've been trying to make. That only happens with the human quotient. The data quotient will never fully ever get us there. So I appreciate the opportunity, my friend. It's always great seeing you.
You as well. Thank you.